As the temps start rising, I feel the familiar urge to refresh my closet, but I don't want to waste money on pieces I'll only wear once or for just one season. Thankfully, Quince changes that. Their clothes are timeless, lightweight, and far more elevated than anything else at this price. It finally feels like my wardrobe matches my standards. The best part is that Quince only works with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing practices and premium fabrics and finishes, so you get to look good while feeling good. I'm pretty excited that I have upgraded my athleisure wardrobe for this summer. I bought a sweatshirt and a pair of wide-leg flow pants that are two of the softest items I own, and I plan to live in them. So join me in giving your summer closet an upgrade with Quince. Go to quince.com/POTC for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's QUINCE.com/POTC to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/POTC.
When I'm asked for my kind of quick and easy definition of EMDR, it shifts how information is stored in the brain. It doesn't erase bad memories. It's not a deletion process for bad memories. It shifts how the information is stored so that when it's no longer stored in this place of activation, we're able to see it. You know, I love your chess metaphor here, kind of in a larger context of what the whole board looks like.
That was Dr. Jamie Marich on Psychologists Off the Clock.
We are 4 experts in psychology here to bring you cutting-edge and science-based ideas from psychology to help you flourish in your relationships, work, and health.
I'm Dr. Debbie Sorensen, a clinical psychologist practicing in Mile High, Denver, Colorado, and author of Act for Burnout, Act Daily Journal, and the Act Daily Card Deck.
From America's Heartland, I'm Dr. Emily Edlin, a clinical psychologist based in Chicago, Illinois, and author of Autonomy Supportive Parenting.
Calling in from Vienna, Austria, I'm Michael Herold, ACT coach, confidence trainer, and author of an upcoming book on being a better conversationalist and making friends.
And from coastal New England, I'm Dr. Jill Stoddard, author of Be Mighty, the Big Book of ACT Metaphors, and Imposter No More.
We hope you take what you learn here to build a rich and meaningful life.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock. Hello, everyone. I am sitting here with Jill to do the intro for my episode on EMDR with Jamie Marich. Now, I have to set the stage a little bit and tell you how this episode came about. And so you have to keep in mind, I'm not a PhD. I'm not a trained psychologist. So one of my best friends started doing EMDR in therapy, and another really good friend started to get trained in EMDR. And I was getting really curious about what is this EMDR. So one Monday, I brought this to the team meeting and I said, hey, I would like to do an EMDR episode. And turns out we haven't had that theme on the show yet. And I also learned that EMDR is somewhat controversial as well. I didn't know about this. You'll hear us discuss that in the episode. So Jill, maybe you can explain a little bit the controversy around EMDR.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, I'm so glad we're doing this episode because EMDR is incredibly popular. It's even making appearances on many Law and Order SVU episodes these days. So I do think, people are really wondering about it. And the main issue is that, she says in the episode that, the eye movement part of EMDR, which as you talk about stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, is theoretical. It went from eye movement to all kinds of different bilateral stimulation. And she says there are 3 or 4 theories out there. And at the end of the day, how this therapy works is an empirical question that is yet unanswered. And there have been a number of studies that have looked at this therapy, basically dismantling studies where they take the elements out and kind of test them separately, just to put it in really simple terms. And they have not been able to establish that the bilateral stimulation actually adds anything. So there's a concept known as it's like the purple hat something. And what it means is you take an already well-established treatment. So in this case, it would be exposure therapy. We know that exposure therapy works. We know how it works. So you take exposure therapy and then you add some other element. But the argument is that element can't be shown to actually be adding anything else. It would be like just adding a purple hat to something. Oh, look, this works because of the purple hat, but it's already working and you can't prove that the purple hat is actually adding anything to it. So that's really where the main controversy comes from.
Purple hat. Okay, that's so interesting. I've never heard that before, but I'm going to use it a lot from here on out. Now, I will say that towards the end of the episode, Jamie and I, firstly, she that addresses like the fact that there are certain things that aren't yet clear about EMDR. And at the same time, I'm still asking myself, like, this is immensely popular out there.
Mm-hmm.
Where's this coming from?
Right. Well, I think, I can speak to just my personal experience of having lots of therapists in my network, my personal and professional network. And I hear things like, I do exposure therapy first and foremost, and it works, but sometimes my clients hit a plateau. And when I do EMDR, it's like the thing they need that kind of pushes them forward. These are the kind of anecdotes I hear. Therapists swear it works, clients swear it works. And at one point, Jamie says, sometimes it's hard to put in words what's actually happening. And you kind of have to be in the room to see it. And then you're like, oh my gosh, this really works. And of course, that's not scientific. And we need to have science to really show this because placebos work too, right? And so we really need to understand what is going on. And I really hope that science arises at some point and we get answers to these questions. But I'll tell you a little personal story, because, I have this knowledge about this being controversial and I see the efficacy, and the stories of efficacy in an anecdotal setting. I just felt really torn and conflicted. Like, how am I supposed to feel about this treatment? And so again, this is not science. It's just a personal little story. But I decided, you know what? I'm going to go test it out. So I went and participated as a client in EMDR therapy for some old trauma that I had from college. And I will tell you, Michael, I went in there as skeptical as a person can be. Like I was really taught in grad school that this is hooey, that it's pseudoscience. I mean, I really went in with this bias. And it's my understanding for a placebo to work, you have to believe that it's going to work. And after one session, I called my friend who's an EMDR therapist, and I literally said to her, what is this voodoo magic? I experienced it as so incredibly powerful and helpful. And those changes have had a lasting impact. And this was many months ago. And like Jamie said, you kind of just have to be in the room to experience that. And so like the scientist in me doesn't like that. And the person in me absolutely had that experience.
Okay, follow-up question. Could that have been the exposure element alone?
Yes. So that's just it, right? Yes, it absolutely could have been the exposure element. I will say I have done a lot of exposure therapy as a therapist, and it is hard. It is effective and it is powerful, and I love it. And it requires a lot of willingness to experience some very, very big feelings. When I did EMDR, it's different in that way. Yes, you talk a little bit, and she talks about this in the episode. You do talk a little bit about what happened, but not in that like detailed, really accessing every emotion.
Yes.
To me, it felt very safe. It felt not super intimidating. It didn't feel really hard. I wasn't super exhausted afterward. So there's something about it that just, it's a little bit gentler, I guess. And I think that's why so many EMDR therapists prefer it. It's like, if both of these things can work, why not do the thing that people experience as a little bit easier, a little bit more gentle? And I'm not saying that's necessarily how I feel about it, because like I said, I've done a lot of really powerful exposure work, but it's a very interesting conundrum across the board.
Yeah, exposure is very hard. And my understanding, what little understanding I had going in, and now I have a little more. The main takeaway from me was that EMDR seems to take that punch, some of the punch away that exposure is going to deliver. And I work in exposure, with exposure for like small social events, social anxiety, small stuff. I don't even involve snakes or spiders. And thinking that using something like that in a traumatic event, if there's a way to take that some or a lot of that punch away to work on it, that sounds like a really good deal.
Yeah, I think that's the argument that a lot of people make. Yeah.
Well, dear listener, I hope this episode with Jamie Marich on EMDR is going to bring some information your way, maybe satisfy some curiosity, and maybe bring you to EMDR as well. So I hope you'll enjoy my interview with Jamie Marich. Dr. Jamie Marich is a speaker, author, clinical trauma specialist, and advocate. She's the author of 14 books, including Healing Addiction with EMDR Therapy, a trauma-focused guide, Trauma and the 12 Steps, an inclusive guide to enhancing recovery, and EMDR Made Simple, 4 approaches for using EMDR with any client. She's a woman in long-term recovery from an addictive disorder and lives with dissociative identities. As a queer woman who survived multiple spiritually abusive experiences in childhood and adulthood, Jamie is passionate about helping people to recognize where religion and spirituality may be causing harm in their lives so that they can chart a course for personalized healing. Well, hello, Jamie. I'm so glad to have you on the show. It's good to see you.
Hello, Michael. I'm very delighted to be here.
So this is going to be an interesting interview for me because to a certain degree, I'm doing this interview with you to satisfy my own curiosity. We're going to talk about EMDR, eye movement, desensitization, and reprocessing. That's quite a mouthful. So I'm glad we have EMDR to come back to because I've heard so much about EMDR lately. I have friends that go through EMDR treatment. I have colleagues that learn to be EMDR therapists. And I just wanted to find out what that is. And so I figured, why don't I bring someone on the podcast to talk to and explain this to me? And I figured, why not invite the originator, Francine Shapiro? And then it turned out that's not going to be possible without a Ouija board because she left us a few years ago. She passed on. And so I reached out to my colleagues and I said, okay, EMDR, what are the top names? Like, who should I talk to? And the replies were like, Jamie Marich, Jamie Marich, Jamie Marich, Jamie Marich, Jamie Marich. So I reached out to the Jamie Marich and I'm so happy you jumped on the show. So I do have a little bit of knowledge. Dear listener, bear with me. I'm going to ask a lot of newbie questions because this is a field that's very new to me. I grabbed your book, EMDR Made Simple, and your colleague's book, Rotem Breyer's The Art and Science of EMDR, for which you wrote the foreword. And I still consider myself such a newbie in that topic. So let's get started with my own training in the field.
Sure, let's get started. So as you accurately identified, it is a mouthful to say eye movement, desensitization, and reprocessing. And for folks who are new to this, I think it's best to start with the origin story that the founder, Dr. Francine Shapiro, has put out there about EMDR. Yet I will also give you a little bit of context as I go around that. Because on one hand, what Dr. Shapiro developed in EMDR and meticulously promoted the research of and the scrutiny of in the years following her discovery is now considered an evidence-based practice for the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder. It's high on the World Health Organization's approval list for working with trauma-related symptomology. And so what Dr. Shapiro created is something that seems very technical. But the context I want people to understand is Shapiro herself was a practitioner of mind-body medicine in the 80s when she discovered this. And that was because of her own journey with battling cancer. She was a cancer survivor. It's something she dealt with her whole life until she left the body. And so as she has said in interviews, she was a meticulous student of mind-body medicine practices. She was a mindfulness meditator. She identified Stephen Levine, who is a colleague of Jack Kornfield. Stephen Levine's no longer with us either. She identified Stephen and Andrea Levine as her meditation teachers. So those of us who are in the know about mindfulness know that she had a lot of meditation and mind-body grounding. even leading up to this famous walk in the park that she took in 1987. And this is where she really starts the origin story that gets most cited. But she doesn't hide the fact that it's not the only thing she did in the mind-body realm. And I think that's important to recognize. So as she was taking this walk in the park, this mythical walk in the park, as she tells the story.
Does she use the word mythical?
Well, she didn't use the word mythical, but it is kind of the stuff of legend at this point, that even if you read her different books, you see different accountings on the story. And that's something that critics have pointed out, like she can't keep her story straight. I see that as she took several walks in the park. Because she even said when she took this walk in the park, it wasn't a eureka moment. It was part of this larger context around constantly experimenting on herself and being curious about, if I do this with a bodily process, how's it going to affect my mental process? If I do this visualization, how's it going to affect my body? So as the story goes, she was taking a walk in the park and some disturbing thoughts emerged for her. She has said in interviews that they were the types of thoughts that you normally would have to engage deliberately, but they just came up. And as they came up, she stayed with them like a good meditator would. And she noticed that her eyes started moving back and forth as she did that. And so eventually she sat down and continued to let the eyes move back and forth. Some versions of the story will say she tracked light on water. Other versions will say she was tracking trees. That really helped her keep this rapid back and forth eye movement going. And I already mentioned it was not a eureka thing, but later that night when she brought up some of those same thoughts, they just didn't have the validity. They didn't have the charge. They didn't have the impact. So her first response was, isn't that interesting? Which to me also is evidence of her meditation training. And so she gathered a group of her friends and colleagues together to see if the same process would happen if she engaged the eye movements deliberately. So she would move her fingers back and forth and ask them to track the movement of her fingers. That's why sometimes people call it EMDR, the finger wagging therapy. And in training, we talk about it really varies person to person what a person can need. But initially, when a person is in a space to start reprocessing traumatic memories, we would go back and forth with the fingers rapidly, but not so fast that a person can't tolerate the speed, about 24 to 36 times back and forth. And one of the things we cover in training is to get feedback from a person on, wait, you're going too long, you're going too short.
So it would be like a clock, almost like a tick-tock.
Yes, it's like a tick-tock on a clock. Yeah. And another metaphor that I like to use, it's like a gas pedal on a car. That some people can tolerate the car going faster and longer, and other people need to take breaks more frequently to check in with mental content as you go. So when she tried this out with her friends, a similar effect was observed. And what she thought she stumbled into was desensitization. That maybe there is something going on here that is akin to REM sleep in an awakened state. And because we process when we dream, and when we dream, we're in REM sleep. So maybe we're just doing a REM process here with eyes open, which is why people were having desensitization. So she, again, knew she had to research this for it to be taken seriously, because on the surface, it sounded very bizarre. And as part of her doctoral dissertation finishing up, she did research. The initial research study was actually with Vietnam veterans. And it was published in 1989 as EMD, just eye movement desensitization, because that was her initial working hypothesis, was that it was a desensitization process. And maybe this thing with the eyes was helping us to get beyond words. Because the other part of the historical context I want people to consider, this was 87 to 89. And the post-traumatic stress disorder diagnosis had only been introduced in 1980. Following advocacy, following the Vietnam War. So, of course, trauma and post-traumatic stress is not new to 1980, but 1980s is when we first saw it really getting attention and recognition by mainstream psychology. And at the time, there were no real therapies that were developed or researched specifically for trauma-related issues. A lot of practitioners proceeded working with trauma with therapy approaches as usual that were around, cognitive methods, psychodynamic methods, Gestalt methods, which could be quite good. but there was nothing that was really specifically targeted. And so obviously when EMDR debuted, or EMD debuted in 1989, many people panned it as, this is witchcraft, this is woo-woo, this is something that some charlatan is trying to promote.
In that regard, because now we're throwing some numbers out there, some years.
Right.
Now, I'm curious, the EM in EMDR is the same EM that's in REM sleep, in rapid eye movement.
Yes.
When was rapid eye movement discovered? Do you know?
I don't offhand. I'd have to look that up.
Okay, then we'll invite the listeners to Google that themselves. Yes. Your listeners.
It's definitely
you'll be able to pull that off.
Or Googleable for sure. But yeah, it had been discussed enough as a psychological, psychiatric construct at that point, where she would have had that knowledge of REM. So there were enough people, though, in the field who initially thought this was interesting and were willing to get trained in it, because they grew frustrated with talk therapy alone does not seem to be effective for working with trauma. So maybe this thing with the eyes, there's something to it.
Let's take this in exactly that route, because I think since we touched upon PTSD, and by the way, would it be correct to use PTSD and trauma somewhat synonymously? Or am I making a grave mistake here?
No, it's a great question. So they're not synonymous, but they're related in that, and this is something even Shapiro was a leader in identifying, that up until that point, so many folks in the field didn't think trauma was an issue unless it was a PTSD diagnosis.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And the PTSD diagnosis, especially in the 80s, it's gotten a little more open-ended now as we've learned more about it, was very event-centric. The one thing that happens to you that causes lasting impact in these certain symptoms. But Shapiro even identified in her early writing that not all trauma necessarily leads to a PTSD diagnosis. It can show up in other diagnoses.
Is this where she talks about the capital T trauma and the small t trauma?
Yeah, initially she codified it as big T trauma versus small t trauma. Big T traumas are things that are generally life or injury threatening that would get you a PTSD diagnosis per the DSM or the ICD. Small T traumas at the time she identified as those traumatic experiences that are wounding, because in the English language, trauma just means wound. Wounding experiences that cause impact. So things like getting a divorce, going through an infidelity experience, being bullied verbally, where there's not necessarily, it would not necessarily meet the level of PTSD in terms of your symptoms, but it might show up as other issues like depression, adjustment disorders, a lot of dissociative. I think just about every dissociative disorder has a root in some kind of unhealed trauma. So she was really, in my view, the leader that started expanding this discussion about what trauma even means. And that, yes, we tend to go to PTSD first, yet if we appreciate this larger definition of trauma, it can show up in many different diagnoses. So that is the answer to that question.
Hey, Michael here. As you might have already heard, I'm currently working on a book on confidence building, having better conversations, and making friends. Would you like to work with me to make this happen? I don't know about you, but I like self-development books that aren't just about the theory and the exercises. I like books that are full of real stories and insights from people who have worked through the concepts and have gotten the results they wanted. And that's how I envision my book too. So I'm looking for a handful of coaching clients to work with me over the next couple of weeks. If you struggle with confidence or your social skills, we can work together for 8 weeks in one-on-one coaching sessions that are tailored towards your specific goals. And your story will, anonymously, of course, be featured in my book and help and inspire others. I'm only going to work on this with 10 people, and as a thank you, offer 50% off my coaching package. If you think this is for you, then head over to herald.coach/book and apply. That's all. Back to the show. So you mentioned that talk therapy didn't seem to work that well with trauma and PTSD. Why is that?
Because talk therapy alone primarily works with, in layperson's terms, the front of the brain, the neocortex, the more rational verbal parts that are designed to make sense of experience and keep a chronological timeline. And
the part we play chess with.
The part we play chess with. Very nicely put. Yet, when a traumatic experience remains unprocessed, it tends to get stored in a state-specific form that still carries a lot of activation, specifically what we might call limbic level activation. And that limbic brain is often described as the emotional brain. It is a learning brain because we learn things as a result of traumatic experiences. But unless we learn something different or that material has a chance to be processed, it can stay stuck. And the limbic brain, I describe it this way. It's the brain that you have in common, most have in common with a dog or a cat or a horse.
So it's a lot of fight, flight, freeze.
A lot
response.
of fight, flight, freeze, especially then when you're bringing in the lowest brain, the brain stem to go along with that. A lot of, I think this is the important thing to recognize, no rational sense of time. The amygdala, which is part of this limbic system, has no clock. So this thing could have happened to you 30 years ago, but if it's still stored in that state-specific form that's very highly charged, the proverb that I think best describes this, it's from the Chinese tradition, is once you've been bitten by a snake, you're afraid even of a piece of rope.
Yeah.
And so when material remains unprocessed, it has a lot of that limbic or brainstem level activation. And until we can literally move how it's stored in the brain to this primary neocortex place, we can still be very reactive from those old places and those old scripts. That it's not to say words can't be important, because a lot of us use words to describe feeling. A lot of us who are writers, the verbal content becomes very important. But if the words inhibit us from actually feeling into our bodies or expressing what we need to express, feel what we need to feel. And the thing I feel is important, bringing up the dogs and the cats and the horses too, is if you have a pet or you're an animal person, I'd like you to think about what they have taught you about existence. But I will say, having had animals in my recovery process has been fascinating because they've taught me so much about unconditional love, and that words often aren't important. Like, I talk to them, but they don't talk back to me. It's presence. It's having that energetic holding of space, that cuddliness, that I have relationship with people, even with beings, I should say, even without words. So for those of you who are animal people, that might help you better understand the limbic system.
So if I understand that correctly, then because you mentioned the snake and the stick,
right?
That when you have a traumatic experience, air quotes, saved in your brain, you see something like a stick or a rope, and it brings back the entire explosion of, because the brain can't keep track of time. So it doesn't recognize that this thing with the snake happened 30 years ago.
Correct.
But it's like, I see a rope and boom, the entire thing, like completely experientially, like fully back in the situation 30 years ago when the entire thing happened.
Yeah. And so we just cannot get to that level of activation by words alone.
I can't talk about that. Yeah.
Okay. Notice what I said by words alone, because I want to be very clear that my role here is not to demonize talk therapy.
No, of course.
Or what we do with cognitive strategies, yet alone it is insufficient. Because in EMDR therapy, when we set up a protocol for doing these eye movements or other forms of bilateral work, we do quite a bit of talk to get it set up, and people's cognitions and their cognitive experiences are honored. It's one of the things Shapiro said in an early interview, was that your approach for doing therapy, however you were trained before EMDR, is likely going to be honored in EMDR therapy. And one of the reasons I really like it is we do ask people questions, not just about their thinking brain and their cognitions, but what are they feeling? What's happening in the body? What might they be seeing? How might other senses be activated? And then we can ask a lot of these questions connected to a traumatic experience and then start the eye movements. And that is often how this material moves. Now, that being said, part of what, going kind of back to the history here, in her early development, she did see the importance of being able to prepare a person. because I never want anybody to hear me do an interview and think, oh, I just jump in and in the first session, a therapist is going to bring up the worst traumatic experience of my life.
What does the preparation then, because you're right, like this was a question that I had, that if it's a bilateral stimulation, whether it's the finger movement or tapping or audio, I think works as well. It's like, why don't I just do that at home by myself if it's just that, right? So what does a therapist do? Or maybe before, I feel like in my brain there are two dots that are not quite connected. So we have the traumatic experience and then the work with the therapist who's going to use bilateral stimulation with me. Here's the question. That's the dot that I'm missing. Why the bilateral stimulation to access the trauma? So in my understanding, what it does is, just like with the origin story you told earlier, is that eye movement was somehow, what's the right word, disarming the experience a little bit. So in my understanding of EMDR, the very like layman's terms, is that by that bilateral stimulation, be it the fingers that I'm tracking with my eyes, or tapping knees, or holding devices, or auditory, or whatever else it might be, I'm for some reason, and here's the big why for you. For some reason, now I can go to the rope, to the stick, to the traumatic event without the entire explosion of things firing off at once.
So let me help to connect the dot, because what we know right now about the eye movements or the impact of the bilateral movement is actually still theoretical. There's still like 3 or 4 working theories about what exactly the eye movements are doing that are creating these results that we're seeing. So I would say, because you actually helped me to make a connection for ourselves here, the dual attention or the bilateral stimulation is not what's accessing the traumatic material. It's what's helping it to move.
To move.
Yes, because I can access traumatic material by asking you a series of questions that might make you uncomfortable or slightly activated.
And then fire the entire thing.
Yes. Like a lot of things can fire up the system. But the application of the dual attention stimulus is what helps it to move from more of that limbic level storage to primary storage in the neocortex, where it's more efficient and it's not going to cause us the problems long term. The best explanation I can give is, I'm giving full credit to my colleague Amber Stiles-Bodnar, who is way more of a neuro person than I am, because I'm still very much an English teacher and humanitarian and how I do a lot of this work. But as Amber describes it, the dual attention stimulus itself, the back and forth, opens up, this is what we believe is happening, opens up a neurofiber bridge between the limbic system and the corpus callosum. And the corpus callosum is essentially where the neocortex, the chest brain, starts.
And that's the thing that connects both halves of the brain, right?
Yes, the corpus callosum. So what the dual attention stimulus, we believe, is doing is like widening the lanes of this bridge so that information can pass over more effectively and connections can be made. And that's one of the reasons we even use the bilateral, the dual attention, when we do some preparation work. So you can do a visualization exercise with someone, like a calm, safe place, or a healing light stream, or a mindfulness strategy. And if you add some tapping along with it, bilateral tapping back and forth, bilateral eye movements back and forth, this is where we tend to do it at a slower pace. It simply widens those lanes to create more of a connection. So even with that positive or adaptive material, we can feel that more viscerally connected as well when we apply the dual attention. But then where information processing happens is when I now, instead of having you go to the calm, safe place with puppies and a warm and healing light, I activate the traumatic neural network when the client indicates readiness or preparation by asking you a series of questions to get that network activated. And that is where you still see a lot of talk elements in EMDR. And then from there, we can apply the dual attention back and forth, either with eye movements or tapping or audio tones at a faster rate. And that will hopefully promote how information shifts. So when I'm asked for my kind of quick and easy definition of EMDR, it shifts how information is stored in the brain. It doesn't erase bad memories. It's not a deletion process for bad memories. It shifts how the information is stored so that when it's no longer stored in this place of activation, we're able to see it. I love your chess metaphor here, kind of in a larger context of what the whole board looks like.
So in my understanding, a air quotes normal memory would be over time processed by my brain, and something that stung really bad because I got yelled at by a waiter yesterday and it really stung. But give it a couple of days and it's like disarmed. It's still a memory, but the emotional impact of it has somewhat been separated from that, which is something, if I understand it correctly, happens in REM sleep, where that disconnect happens a little bit. So that is a normal memory that over time just loses its punch. But that's because it's a memory that my prefrontal cortex has access to. Now I'm looking at a traumatic experience, and it's just stored in the reptilian brain and the R complex. It's stored in the limbic brain, and my chessboard brain can't work with it. It can't access it. So we're using the bilateral stimulation to open the gates in the brain and to access that part of my memory so that my chess player in my brain can also look at this.
I think that's very well put, because what the dual attention is doing, and different theorists might explain this to you differently, but based on what I know of the working theories and what I have experienced as a clinician who's done thousands of sessions of this, is this dual attention or bilateral movement, opens the gates further. And that can open the gates for the good stuff to come in too. That's what's important to recognize. And Shapiro, even in her theories or her early descriptions of EMDR was clear about that the adaptive that the information processing networks in the brain store adaptive or positive material too.
Even about a traumatic event?
Possibly, yeah. Because think about this. We learn things as a result of traumatic experience. One of the learnings we could get is something like, I'm resilient.
Yeah.
I am a survivor. But even the same traumatic event can also leave us with something like, I'm defective now because my body experienced some kind of damage during this. So learning can always be mixed. And something that she hoped people would do by processing information is link up that negative material, or that maladaptive material is the word she used, with the positive stuff that's there as well.
Has that something to do with how our retrieval of memories works? Where, I think I learned this from your book, that when a normal memory is retrieved, you can think about it like taking a Post-it note out of a drawer, and then it gets modified somehow by that process. So if I'm thinking back to eating ice cream last week, true story, and I'm thinking back to that event now, when I'm feeling a little bit stressed, a little bit anxious, now that memory of me eating ice cream on the first day in spring here in Vienna gets this little bit of a flavor of stress and anxiety, because that was my state when I last looked at that Post-it note, that memory, before it goes back into the drawer. And that is what we do with this activation of that maladaptive network as well.
So so I'm quoting her adaptive information processing model here to answer your question. Memory is memory, and they tend to get coded in our brain as pleasant, unpleasant, neutral, or what she would say adaptive, maladaptive, or neutral. And those positive memories or those neutral memories are still there, but they usually, don't have the charge with them. You could look at, using your Post-it note example of, I ate ice cream. That's interesting. But when there's, the best general word I can use is charge. When there's activation, when there's something that brings up this implicit sense of something's wrong, I'm in danger.
Yeah, the Post-it note is not going to explode, but the stick might cause that.
Right. But that can keep us cut off from seeing all the good material in those Post-it notes that tells us how, an example I'll use is I have all these mindfulness practices that are well practiced and that I know to keep me calm in stressful situations. But if one of those Post-it notes get explosive or they feel like a snake, I may suddenly forget how to stay calm. It can shut everything down, might be a good way to put that. So in her information processing model, she says that when these traumatic memories, negative memories, highly charged memories might be a better way to look at it. When they get activated in the present by something that's reminiscent, it can keep us cut off from that adaptive material or that neutral material that would tell us, okay, this is what to do.
I don't want to give the impression, and maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't want to think about it like saying, hey, there's a lot of good in trauma. Let's bring that out.
Yeah, it's not even there's a lot of good in trauma. There might be a lot of good in your life that doesn't necessarily connect to traumatic memories. It could be the memory, as I use the example, that I know how to meditate. I know how to calm myself down. It could be the memory of I am able to achieve things, the memory of my college graduation. So memory, it's not just the positive learnings from traumatic experiences. It's any positive or adaptive learning that is there. We might have a hard time linking up with it when a traumatic network gets activated. And so the metaphor she'll often use in her writing is that she hopes negative neural networks or maladaptive neural networks can connect back with that positive material that may have information like, I know how to do this. I know how to keep myself calm. I know how to be skillful in these situations. And her whole point is that when traumatic memory gets overstimulated, gets too activated, we cannot link up with anything that's positive or adaptive. And that most of that is stored in the neocortex, in the playing chess brain. And the hope is that this accelerated process of the eye movements or the other tapping going over the bridge can help it link up. Now, I do want to go back to the part of the origin story I didn't finish. So it was initially discovered as eye movements. And her thought was that it was eye movements. That is what was doing the processing. And then in 1990, kind of close to the beginning of this founding, is when a blind individual came along and wanted to have EMDR done. And they could not find a way to easily get them to track eye movements. So she had a friend who was able to generate a stereo headphone setup and create audio tones going back and forth. And that is where the other form of stimulations started coming in as potential options here for allowing information to process. So it was that event and another event that happened at the same time, but they were fundamentally different things. Remember, her initial thought was that it was simply creating desensitization. So there's a traumatic memory I experience at a level of 10. Maybe now I experience the intensity at a level of 1 or 0. That's the desensitization. But this is what she was not expecting during the initial discovery. People were also then making statements about a shift in their belief about their own selves or the world. So where a person may have initially believed something like, I am defective. After engaging in this desensitization, then content started coming up that was more connected to positive self states, like, I am an achiever. I can do this. I am a survivor. My disability does not define me, might be another example of that. So she was not even expecting that in the early days, that people would have shifts in their belief about self. And that is where she started looking at this idea of connecting the adaptive, that maybe this maladaptive material, until it gets processed, is just not able to connect with more of the positive material of the positive or adaptive things people have learned about themselves. And part of where preparation work is important is that some clients come in without a lot of positive self-efficacy or things that they're aware of that have happened to them. So this is where we can help people build it. And this is where a lot of other therapeutic approaches can be used alongside EMDR. I mean, she was very much a student of visualization and brought that into her work. A lot of us who do mindfulness informed work now, dialectical behavior therapy, Gestalt work, movement work, that works well for EMDR preparation. And we can use this dual attention or bilateral process to help create those connections. And that is fundamentally what we believe the bilateral, or now we tend to call it dual attention, does. So whether it is eye movements, whether it is tapping, whether it is tones, it's widening the lanes is the best metaphor that I like to use, so that we can create connections and shift how maladaptive information is stored so that we can link up with more positive. And the reason I kind of struggle with some of this language is I use positive because that's easiest for like the lay listener who doesn't know EMDR to understand. But Shapiro leaned into this language of adaptive and maladaptive because she felt that positive and negative was a little too value laden. And that something that you might see as positive, I might see as negative. And so that's the other part of the origin story I just want people to understand, because even now there's a debate amongst EMDR practitioners about what's really doing it. There are some people who I call eye movement purists who believe that her original eye movement method should be used, that that's what is really what's causing these shifts and these linkages in the brain. There are others of us, and I'm more in this camp, which is they can all work. I have seen all of them work, the eye movements, the tones, the tapping in my clinical settings. And it's fundamentally about having a person choose which method is going to feel best for them in the process in order to facilitate these linkages or these connections. And I'm often that cheeky one who calls out the fact that when we talk about the EMDR origin story, I don't think we discuss enough the fact that Shapiro was taking a walk in the park before this thing happened with her eyes. And walking is bilateral. And I just want to say that there are other people who really study the neurobiology of this as their main specialty. I know enough of it to inform what I do in practice and teaching. Yet for me, so much of the wonder of EMDR I've seen has been, it's like, yeah, it works. And I know this sounds like a cheap answer because sometimes you can't really know how it works until you experience it. Because I don't know if anybody would have been able to explain it to me in a way that would have made it make sense to me before I actually got in there and did it and realized that, wow, there's just a lot here that words can't get at.
Yeah.
That is helping me connect more of this head brain with the rest of my brain and body.
Okay. So yeah, you're absolutely right. Like that last chapter in the story, the reprocessing part illuminated some of that. And this is probably a misunderstanding on my side. So bear with me here. I just felt that when we were talking about, air quotes, the positive aspect of trauma, I felt it wouldn't describe EMDR correctly, saying that what EMDR does is look at your trauma and bring out the good in it. Because I can imagine that a lot of people will say, no, there is absolutely nothing good in my trauma, and they might actually be right. So there might be good things to be found in that traumatic experience, like my disability makes me really strong, I am resilient, I'm able to survive this, and so on. And maybe, air quotes again, I'm using a lot of air quotes today, all that EMDR does is just take some punch out of that rope, that stick, out of that maladaptive networks that explodes the moment we see a verbal, a visual, whatever trigger, and it just take a little bit of a punch out of that so that we can reprocess the event and connect it with positive things that maybe the therapist helps us find as well, like, hey, I'm still standing, I'm still strong, I have a supportive network. So walk me through EMDR, and not an EMDR session, but maybe several EMDR sessions. What happens when I come? Because this is where I got sidetracked when I said, why don't I just do that alone? If all I need to do is like tap or have headphones on and go to that event, why do I need this therapist? And of course, there's plenty of reasons why this needs to be done with a trained professional. So how do those sessions, how would they look like?
Well, EMDR, as Shapiro designed it, happens in what she calls 8 phases, not necessarily 8 sessions, because sometimes people need a lot of time in phase 1 and 2, which is the initial groundwork, history taking, and preparation. So part of what initial therapy can look like, and this is where it depends, because some people start working with an EMDR therapist after already having worked with them in other forms of therapy. So there is a good sense of the history. But sometimes people come in fresh to EMDR sessions and the therapist doesn't have a sense of the history. So we do need to get a sense of our client's history, just like we would in any other form of therapy. But part of what makes the EMDR history taking process a little more unique is we're keenly interested in what role is traumatic experience playing in the presenting issue they're coming to us with. So let's say they are coming with what might look like run-of-the-mill depression. What are some themes under that? What does that depression really seem to be about? Hopelessness at the state of the world. Maybe it's about low self-esteem. And then from there, we can explore, and what is giving you that low self-esteem? What are some negative belief states that you have about yourself? What are some negative beliefs you carry about the world? And then from there, we ask folks a series of questions to really get at their own origin stories behind some of these beliefs. And there are different methods for taking history that different EMDR therapists use, but the thing we all have in common seems to be looking at the role that trauma, or what Shapiro later called adverse life experience, that's what she later called small t trauma, what role are those unprocessed experiences playing in creating the presenting issue? So sometimes a person's able to get at that right away in a first session. Other times we may have to build a little more rapport and actually go to some phase 2 preparation work before a person will share with us where we need to go.
Is it sometimes the task of the therapist to help the client unearth that adverse life experience as well, that they might not even know that their presenting problem is connected to this event?
Yes. And we can ask a series of questions to get them there. And that's sometimes why the history taking process is very powerful, because a client has like, oh, wow, I never made that connection and I don't know what we're getting. And so we have to help guide folks through that. So the EMDR phase 2 process, which is called preparation, can take on a lot of different forms. Shapiro's 3 skills that she really emphasized for preparation were all more visualization oriented. And she was a student of visualization herself. That's what she identifies as helped with a lot of her cancer treatments, right? So she ended up really emphasizing a calm, safe place type of exercise, a light stream type of exercise, and then an exercise we call container, which is where a person can actually visualize a container, like a box that they can put material into that we might not have time to finish in the scope of a session. Now, phase 2 is where a lot of us have expanded on her initial work because we've recognized not everybody's optimally visual. So we may have to use more somatic and embodied strategies here, more expressive art strategies here, more mindfulness strategies here. Phase 2 is where I like to say EMDR plays very well with other therapies. We can use some DBT here, even CBT here, or other Gestalt strategies, expressive strategies. Phase 2 is where we make sure a person can handle, or at least reasonably handle, what might come up. Then when we start what the general public seems to know as the EMDR process, which is where we activate the traumatic network. So once we feel a person has adequate preparation, and some clients need less than 1 session of that because they come in already well prepared, and other clients don't even have a conceptualization of what a coping skill means. We may have to spend a little longer with them on preparation work. But then once the therapist and the client determine together that the client's feeling willing to tackle one of these memories, then what a session might look like is we indicate the memory that's going to be worked on. We ask a series of questions to try to get the network activated. And one of my colleagues will say, we ask questions that you learn in training so that we can get the networks juiced up, so that we can get that person like in a reasonable state of activation. And then we commence with the eye movements. And then this is where training will teach you, going some of your earlier questions, how long we should go, how short we should go. We always give a person something called a stop sign. And I even use something called a pause sign, which is, we tell folks, you are in control of this the whole time. So if something comes up that you're not prepared to go to just yet, give me the stop sign. We'll come up with a plan of action. And that's why the preparation skills are there.
In that phase, the client would describe the event verbally in as much detail as possible.
Well, the thing is, as much detail as possible is not really needed in EMDR. That's what distinguishes it from some other forms of trauma therapy, that it is not required that a person goes through so much narrative. So what we might do is indicate, I'm working on this memory of the time my teacher bullied me in the 3rd grade. That's all I need to know. Then I will ask the client a series of questions, like, is there an image or another sensory detail that represents the worst part? And the client, we actually encourage them to give us very succinct answers. They don't have to get so into the words of it. But we'll ask negative belief, positive belief that you would like to believe instead, setting an intention. What's the high level of activation? Where would you rate that? Like on a 0 to 10 scale, where are you feeling it in the body? And then once we've asked the core questions of all these major channels of experience, then we'll start the eye movements. So after a set of eye movements that goes about 24 to 36, we have a person take a breath. What are you noticing now? And even when we ask that, we don't need a very detailed narrative description of what you're noticing now. It could be, I'm just noticing my throat is stuck. Okay, go with that. And then we'll say, go with that, apply another set of eye movements or tapping. And where I want to, because you've referenced this a couple times, where it's important to have a therapist guiding you through this is really for that reason of skilled support. Because if you're just doing this tapping on your own as you bring up negative memories, it might take you down a path that you're feeling like, oh shit, I need some help here. And I'll be honest, I've tried doing some of it on my own, and I think you can do some of the resource and preparation tapping on your own. But it really is important to have a person guide you through kind of the heart of where you're going. I feel it works better, because even though I could technically take myself through this, and there are some programs out there online that I don't like that encourage people to do that, there is something about having positive empathetic support with somebody who's skilled that I think makes this work so much better.
Between the eye movement and then checking in with the client, the stuck jaw, going back in with the client, you always use the finger movements to indicate, okay, now it's time to bring that bilateral stimulation back in. When do you know that it is time to leave that event and move on? Would that be several repetitions of the same event in several sessions?
It depends on the client, because the short answer to your question is when the stress level goes down to 0. And a therapist is trained on how to ask that question of a client when they find that the memory is shifting, when people are reporting more neutral or adaptive content around the memory. So some people can do that in one session. Some people, especially if it is a more complicated memory, may need several sessions to do that. And that's why we have these closure and preparation procedures like a container. So the technical answer to your question is when the distress level goes down to 0. And then we move on to the belief state. Because if a person started with the negative belief like I'm defective, and they wanted to believe something like I am whole, if that's the intention they set, then we ask them, how true does that feel right now? I am whole. And it could be that there's still some more sets of eye movements or tapping that need to be applied if they're not quite fully convinced yet about the more positive belief state. So that would be what happens next. Then we would ask a person, okay, now even when you think of the original memory that we started with, how does your body feel? And so we test it at the desensitization level, at the cognition or belief level, and then the body level. And then there's procedures that EMDR therapists learn about kind of where to go next. After you come back for your next session, after you test this out in life, let's see if there are other related memories we need to work with, or if there's other future orientations of this positive belief that we need to place yourself in. So EMDR, like many therapies, can then go a lot of different places. I always like to disarm this idea that can be out there that once you process one memory in EMDR, then everything is fixed. Because, yeah, for some people, they can get a tremendous amount of relief looking at one horrible memory. Yet for most folks that I've worked with, it is a process where we will have to do this process many times with many different memories in order to help a person achieve the goals they've come in with.
Beautiful. Thank you for walking me through that process. So my last question would be, is EMDR something that you can do through video therapy as well?
Oh, yeah. And this is an interesting question that I think the pandemic illuminated for a lot of us, because prior to the pandemic, there was some of this hesitancy around, well, can you really do it as well online as you can in person? And there were many pioneers who braved ahead and did it online. I know I did some of the preparation work with people online, but I never really felt comfortable doing it as a full method over telehealth. And then once the pandemic happened, we better adapt or people aren't going to be able to access EMDR. And I was pleasantly surprised myself how well it can work online. And we have technologies now that can create like a bouncing ball for eye movements across the screen, or it can create tones where people can do their own tapping. And the therapist guides it to tell them start tapping, stop tapping, or we could set up the chairs as such where people can do eye movements. So yeah, I've been wonderfully surprised and by how well it can work online.
Something good came out of the pandemic. Great. Thank you so much, Jamie. Thank you for your time and for bearing with my questions. Where would you like to send our listeners that are more interested in EMDR now?
Sure. Well, there's a couple places. Probably my most for the general public website that's out there is redefinetherapy.com. And that is where I have a lot of my free demos, any podcast interviews I do, like this one, I go ahead and post up there, or articles. So redefinetherapy.com. If you're interested more, especially if you're a clinician in EMDR training, because you do have to be a clinician to be trained in it, instituteforcreativemindfulness.com is my company. And then jamiemarich.com is just my general website.
Excellent. Well, again, Jamie, thank you so much.
Our pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock. If you enjoy our podcast, you can help us out by leaving a review or contributing on Patreon.
You can get more psychology tips by subscribing to our newsletter and connecting with us on social media.
We'd like to thank our podcast production manager, Jadine Stout-Williams.
This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and is not meant to be a substitute for mental health treatment. If you're looking for mental health treatment, please visit the resources page of our website, offtheclockpsych.com.